He walked into that store with a smile, a resume, and big hopes. 5 minutes later, he walked out without a job, just because of his skin. What no one knew was that the CEO was about to find out, and everything was going to change. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe for more. He had rehearsed his answers a dozen times. Standing in front of the mirror that morning, Rehan smoothed down his only button-up shirt and told himself today would be different. He was 17, smart, polite, and more than ready to take on a part-time job. The tech store downtown, Nextbyte Electronics, had a clean reputation, modern branding, and flexible hours. It was the kind of place that could open doors, give him something solid to add to his college applications. When he arrived 15 minutes early, he sat in the waiting area, hands folded, posture straight, eyes alert. He wanted to make a good impression, but the moment the store manager walked in, that hope began to crack. Cliff Weston, the assistant manager, didn't smile. He gave Rehan a once-over, then looked away like he had walked into the wrong building, like he didn't belong there. Without a word, Cliff grabbed the resume, gave it a lazy glance, and dropped it onto the desk like it wasn't worth reading. His tone was dry, but there was something in his voice that felt sharper than it should have been. He asked no real questions, just a few empty ones, as if he already knew he wouldn't hire him. Then came the vague, loaded comments about the position being high energy and needing someone who fits the store's image. Rehan tried to speak, talk about his computer club, his grades, how he helped his school fix broken tablets. But Cliff cut him off with a small shake of his head. It's not about skills, you understand. It's about presence, culture, the kind of vibe people expect when they walk in here. His eyes held something unspoken but heavy. Rehan knew exactly what he meant, and the words sank into his chest like a stone. He nodded, stood up, and thanked him. He walked out slowly. The air outside felt heavier than before. His mother, Shabana, asked him later how it went. He forced a smile and said, "It was fine. Maybe they'll call." But deep down, he knew they wouldn't. He had seen it in Cliff's face. The decision had already been made before Rehan even sat down. That night, Rehan sat at his desk, staring at his resume. He had worked hard to build that single page, his volunteer work at the community center, his coding projects, his GPA. But in that interview, none of it had mattered. All that effort meant nothing the moment Cliff looked at his skin and decided who he was. Rehan didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat in silence, feeling the quiet weight of something he couldn't change. The next few days passed quietly. Rehan kept applying to other places, coffee shops, bookstores, even a small grocery chain nearby. But no calls came. Every time his phone buzzed, he hoped it would be a reply, but it never was. Still, he didn't complain. He helped Shabana around the house, fixed the Wi-Fi for their elderly neighbor, and even volunteered at the community center where he taught seniors how to use smartphones. He smiled through it all, even when he felt tired, even when it stung. He had grown used to waiting, used to silence after effort. Across town, inside the glossy glass building of Nextbyte's head office, something unexpected happened. A customer named Tanya Malik, who had been shopping in the store the same day as Rehan's interview, had posted a story online. She hadn't meant to start anything, just shared her frustration after watching a young boy being dismissed by the store manager without a fair chance. Her post was short but sharp. Watched a smart, respectful teen get iced out of a job because he didn't fit the culture. You know what that means. Same old garbage. This is why young people lose hope. It didn't explode immediately, but slowly comments trickled in. People began tagging Nextbyte's official account. The post reached Martin Rhodes, the founder and CEO of the company. He was known for building his business on values: equal opportunity, innovation, and community inclusion. When he read the post, he didn't scroll past. He read it again. And then he forwarded it to his HR team with one line: "Find out who this kid is and who treated him like that." Rehan didn't know any of this was happening. He just went on with his day, trying not to think about the quiet rejection that still sat somewhere in the back of his mind. But change had already started moving, just not in a way he could see. Not yet. Martin Rhodes wasn't the kind of CEO who stayed buried behind numbers. He still walked the factory floors, still remembered what it felt like to be overlooked. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, he had built Nextbite from a single kiosk at a weekend market. His success wasn't just built on sales, it was built on people, especially the kind the world often ignored. That's why when the HR team confirmed what the post described, he didn't wait for a PR meeting. He called an emergency internal audit. He wanted to know how many interviews Cliff Weston had handled in the last 3 months, how many had been rejected, and if there was a pattern. It didn't take long to find one. Cliff had denied interviews to nearly every black or brown applicant that came through that location. He never documented proper interview notes, never followed up with HR, and rarely offered a second round. When confronted, Cliff was casual, said they just weren't right for the store. Martin didn't like excuses, especially the kind that tried to sound clean while hiding something ugly underneath. He made another call. This one wasn't to HR, it was to Cliff himself. Meanwhile, Rayhan was at the community center again, sitting with Uncle Fareed, an old man who still typed with one finger. Rayhan laughed gently as the man struggled to unlock his phone, then finally managed to open the camera app. They took a blurry selfie together. Fareed grinned. "If only I had a teacher like you back in the day. Might have become a scientist." Rayhan smiled. "You still can," he said, joking, though he meant it in his heart. He didn't talk about the job anymore. Not even to his best friend Adil, who had started working at a clothing store last week and kept telling him to just lie on his resume next time. Say your uncle's a manager or something. These places don't care about the truth, bro. They just care about who you look like. Rayhan had thought about that, but something inside him refused to fake it. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to be seen as someone else to get a shot. He wanted to walk in as Rayhan Khan and get the job because he had earned it, not because he tricked someone into seeing him differently. Still, it hurt. It hurt to know that someone like Cliff had the power to crush his confidence without even lifting his voice. Back at Nextbite HQ, Martin stared out the window after ending the call with Cliff. The man had been defensive, dismissive, and not the least bit sorry. "I go with my gut," Cliff had said, laughing lightly like it was nothing. "Not everything has to be about race, Martin. People are just too sensitive these days." Martin's jaw tightened. That was all he needed to hear. He picked up his phone again. This time, he asked his executive assistant to get him Rehan's number. There was something about this kid that stayed in his mind. Martin hadn't met him yet, hadn't heard his voice, but he already respected him. Because even in the face of rejection, the boy had walked away with dignity. He didn't record a rant, didn't post an angry tweet, didn't yell at anyone. He had done everything right and still been shut out. Martin wasn't going to let that be the end of the story. Not this time. Rayhan was in his room when the phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, so he let it go once. Then it rang again. Curious, he picked it up. "Hello?" he said, cautious but polite. On the other end, a calm voice replied, "Is this Rayhan Khan?" Rayhan's posture straightened. "Yes, speaking." "This is Martin Rhodes," the man said, his tone serious but not unfriendly. "I'm the CEO of Nextbite. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Rayhan blinked. At first he thought it was a prank. He had no idea how someone like that would even know his name, let alone have a reason to call him. No, sir," he said slowly, still unsure. "It's okay. I'm just at home." "I wanted to speak with you personally," Martin continued, "about something that happened at one of our stores last week. You came in for an interview at our Midtown location, correct?" Rayhan's throat felt tight. He didn't know what to say. For a second, he considered denying it. Maybe it was a trap, some kind of weird test. But the voice on the phone didn't sound like Cliff's. It sounded steady. "Real." "Yes," he said finally. "I did." "I read about it online," Martin said, "and after checking into it myself, I want to apologize. What happened to you wasn't just unfair. It went against everything this company stands for." Rayhan's heart was racing. He hadn't even told anyone about what happened. Not really. Only Adil knew the truth. He hadn't posted anything online, hadn't complained, hadn't even thought anyone had noticed. "I appreciate the apology," Rayhan said after a pause. "But I'm okay. It happens." Martin's voice didn't soften. If anything, it became firmer. No, it shouldn't. And it won't. I've already taken care of the employee who handled your interview, but I'd like to meet you in person at our headquarters. If you're free tomorrow, I'd like you to come by. No interview, just a conversation. I'll have a driver pick you up. Rayhan sat on the edge of his bed, stunned. The phone trembled slightly in his hand. Why me? He asked, almost a whisper. Because I believe in correcting mistakes, Martin said simply, and because someone who can stay quiet and respectful in the face of disrespect has something valuable this company needs. For a long moment, Rayhan didn't speak. He could hear his heartbeat, could feel the weight of the moment landing slowly on his shoulders. Then finally he said, Okay, I'll come. Good, Martin replied. I'll see you at 10. When the call ended, Rayhan sat there for several minutes, staring at the wall. He didn't know what this meant. Was it just a formality? Was it a setup to make the company look better? Or did this man genuinely mean what he said? He told Shabana about the call. She didn't react with excitement, just nodded slowly and said, Keep your heart steady. Just be you. That night, Rayhan didn't sleep much. He kept thinking about what he would say, how he would carry himself. He wasn't sure what would happen, but for the first time in weeks he felt something stir inside him again. Not hope exactly. Something quieter. Something sharper. Like maybe this time, his name wouldn't be ignored. The next morning the car arrived exactly on time. A black sedan with tinted windows pulled up outside Rayhan's building, drawing quiet stares from neighbors leaning out of balconies. The driver stepped out, holding a placard with his name. Rayhan had never been in a car like that before. He hesitated for a moment, then took a breath and got in. Shabana stood at the gate watching him go, her hands folded under her shawl, her eyes proud but calm. She didn't say anything dramatic, just lifted her hand in a small wave, and Rayhan nodded back. The drive to Nextbyte headquarters was quiet. The city moved past the windows in slow motion. Old buildings, cracked sidewalks, fruit carts by the roadside. Then came the glass towers, the cleaner roads, the guarded gates. When the car finally pulled up to the main entrance, Rayhan's mouth went dry. The building looked like something out of a movie. Sleek glass walls, tall ceilings, a giant chrome N turning slowly on top of the main doors. A receptionist greeted him the moment he stepped inside, and within seconds, someone from the HR team appeared to escort him. No waiting, no delay. They led him down a long hallway, past open offices and conference rooms where people in suits typed away on shiny laptops. Rayhan didn't say much. He walked straight, his spine stiff, trying not to look out of place. When they reached the executive floor, the HR manager gave a gentle smile and said, Mr. Rhodes will see you now. Martin's office was large but simple. There were no gold nameplates or oversized furniture. Just books, a few framed photos, and a giant window overlooking the city. Martin stood as Rayhan walked in. He was in his early 50s, tall with short salt and pepper hair, and the kind of eyes that paid attention to everything. Rayhan, he said warmly, stepping forward and shaking his hand. Thank you for coming. Rayhan nodded, unsure if he should sit until Martin gestured to the chair across from his desk. I know this must feel strange, Martin continued. A lot happened quickly. But I want to be clear. This meeting isn't for show. I didn't call you here to fix a company image or check a box. I called you because I saw something in the way you handled that interview. And I believe that kind of strength belongs here. Rayhan looked up slowly. I didn't really do anything, he said quietly. I just didn't want to cause a scene. That's exactly it, Martin replied. You were disrespected, but you didn't lower yourself. That's not weakness. That's control. That's leadership. Rayhan didn't know what to say. No one had ever described him like that before. Not even his teachers. Martin leaned back slightly. I read your resume. I know about your grades, your volunteer work, and your coding projects. You've done more with less than most of the kids we see walking in here with fancy certificates. And I want to offer you more than just an apology. I want to offer you an opportunity. Rayhan's eyes widened. He stayed silent, afraid to speak too soon. I'm offering you a paid internship in our software support division, Martin said. 3 months part-time. If things go well, we'll talk about college sponsorship and long-term options. For a moment, Rayhan just stared. His hands were still in his lap, clenched tightly without him realizing it. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. Then finally, in a low voice, he said, "Are you sure?" Martin smiled. "I wouldn't have brought you here if I wasn't." Rayhan nodded slowly. "Then, I accept." Something shifted in the room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet moment that meant everything. Rayhan had walked into that building thinking he might be made to feel small again. Instead, he had been seen, not as a threat, not as a number, but as someone worth investing in. And somewhere else in the building, Cliff Weston sat in a small room with a box of his belongings in his lap, waiting for security to escort him out. His nameplate had already been pulled off the door. The news spread through the building faster than anyone expected. Most of the employees didn't know the full story, just that a store manager had been fired and a young intern was starting the next week, someone handpicked by Martin himself. That was enough to raise eyebrows. But Martin didn't care about office whispers. He had seen far too many people like Cliff over the years, those who wore suits and smiles but made their decisions with bias buried under polished excuses. He wasn't interested in protecting them anymore. Rayhan started his internship the following Monday. When he stepped into the software division on the 6th floor, he wore the same pair of shoes he had worn to the interview that never really happened. They were old, a little scuffed at the heel, but clean. He carried a second-hand backpack with a borrowed laptop inside, and the moment he entered the office, a few of the senior engineers looked up from their desks. A few smiled politely. Others just nodded and went back to typing. No one rolled their eyes, no one whispered. No one acted like he didn't belong. His team lead, a soft-spoken man named Faraz, welcomed him with a firm handshake. "I read your project on smart inventory tracking," he said. "Pretty sharp idea for a high school student." Rayhan smiled, surprised he had even read it. "Thanks," he said quietly. "It still has some bugs." "So does everything," Faraz replied with a grin. "That's what keeps us employed." The first week was slower than Rayhan had expected. There were no big tasks at first, just shadowing, observing, helping organize internal files, learning how the systems were set up. But he didn't mind. Every day he showed up early, took notes, stayed quiet but alert. He asked questions when it made sense, and when no one was around, he tinkered on his own with unused lines of code, trying to improve them quietly. People noticed, even if they didn't say it. What Rayhan didn't know was that Martin was still watching. Every 2 or 3 days, Martin would check in with Faraz, asking not just about performance but about attitude. Does he seem eager? Is he learning? Does he carry himself with respect? The answers were always the same. Yes, absolutely, more than most. But not everyone was happy about it. In the break room one afternoon, Yusuf, another store manager from a different location, leaned toward his coworker and said, "This is going too far. Kid gets mistreated and suddenly he's a company star? We all had to grind to get here." His coworker raised an eyebrow. "Maybe he's grinding now. You don't know him," Yusuf scoffed. "I just think it's risky. These things get messy. One minute it's PR, the next it's a lawsuit. That's all I'm saying." But what Yusuf didn't know was that the story had already moved far beyond corporate walls. Outside the company, the post about Rayhan's experience had picked up momentum. A few blogs picked it up. Then a local journalist reached out to Tanya Malik, the woman who had posted it. Soon an article ran under the headline, "Denied for the job, hired by the CEO, the boy who walked away quietly." The story didn't use Rayhan's last name at his request, but the details were clear enough for people to understand what had happened. Within hours, the article had thousands of shares. Comments poured in. Some were filled with support, others with disbelief. A few accused the company of using Rayhan to clean up a mistake. But most people didn't care about the company. They cared about the boy. The one who had walked into a place with hope, been turned away, and then lifted back up by someone who actually saw him. Rayhan wasn't on social media much, so he didn't see most of it. But Adil called him the next night, half shouting over the phone. "Bro, you're going viral. You're everywhere. My cousin in Canada just sent me a screenshot." Rayhan chuckled, half embarrassed. "It's not that serious." "Yes, it is. This is wild. You're like the face of staying calm under pressure." Rayhan didn't know how to feel about it. He hadn't asked for attention. He hadn't fought for recognition. All he wanted was to be given a fair chance. And now that he had it, he was more focused on not wasting it than on reading comments about himself. Still, late that night, he searched the article and read it. When he saw his own words quoted, words he hadn't realized someone had remembered, he paused. I didn't want to argue. I just wanted to be respected. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the tab. He didn't need to read the praise. He already knew who he was, and for the first time he felt like the world was beginning to see it too. By the second week of his internship, Rayhan had settled into a quiet rhythm. He arrived early, stayed late, and made sure every task he was given, no matter how small, was done with care. Faraz had started trusting him with more technical work, letting him help troubleshoot a software glitch in one of the company's internal inventory apps. Rehan had spotted a memory leak in the code that had gone unnoticed for weeks. He didn't brag, didn't call attention to it. He just sent a short note with the fix, and Faraz had forwarded it to the entire team with a subject line that read, "Intern found it." Word began to spread through the office. The quiet kid from Midtown wasn't just a PR move. He was smart, focused, steady. One of the senior developers, Aliyah, started sitting with him during breaks, asking about his projects. "You ever thought about building something of your own?" she asked one afternoon. Rayhan shrugged. "I've thought about a few ideas, but I don't really have the tools yet." "You don't need much to start," she said. "Just someone to believe you can do it." Outside of NextBite, the story continued to grow. The local paper that had first published it followed up with a new headline, "Fired Manager Silent as Intern Shines." The piece included anonymous quotes from current employees who admitted they had seen Cliff Weston turn down qualified applicants without proper reason. It also mentioned that the company had initiated new bias training across all regional stores. Martin hadn't waited for approval. He made it company policy. Every hiring manager would undergo the training. No exceptions. Privately, he knew it wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. Cliff, meanwhile, had gone silent. His phone calls to corporate were ignored. His attempt to clear his name on a small blog backfired when people pulled screenshots from the original post. He tried blaming the new culture of oversensitivity, but no one wanted to hear it. He had become a cautionary tale, proof that arrogance and quiet discrimination could cost you everything in the wrong moment. Back at home, Rayhan kept things simple. He still washed the dishes after dinner, still fixed his neighbor's Wi-Fi for free. Shabana noticed the way he walked a little taller now. He still didn't speak much, but his silences had changed. They no longer held the weight of doubt. Now they carried focus. One evening, as they sat on the balcony drinking chai, she looked at him and said, "You know what your father used to say?" Rayhan turned his head, curious. "He said the strongest ones don't raise their voices. They raise their standards." Rayhan smiled, not wide, just enough to let her know he'd heard it. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. That sentence stayed with him long after she'd gone inside. Later that week, something unexpected happened. Rayhan was sitting in a team meeting, reviewing software flowcharts on a shared screen, when the door to the conference room opened and Martin Rhodes stepped in. People sat up straighter. Martin didn't usually drop in unannounced. He nodded at the room, then looked directly at Rayhan. "Can I borrow you for a few minutes?" he asked. Rayhan stood, his pulse quickening slightly. He followed Martin down the hallway to a smaller room just off the executive wing. Inside was a man in a light gray suit, mid-40s, with sharp glasses and a soft voice. "This is Mr. Shaw, one of our legal consultants," Martin said. "He's helping us handle some of the legal and HR matters from what happened earlier." Rayhan felt a sudden tension in his shoulders. "Am I in trouble?" Martin shook his head. "Not at all, but there's something I need to ask." He sat down, folding his hands on the table. "We have documentation, witnesses, video evidence from the store, and your side of the story. You've handled this with grace. But now we're at a point where we need to know. Do you want to press charges?" The question sat heavy in the air. Rayhan hadn't thought about that. Not once. Not seriously. "I didn't come here for revenge," he said finally. "I just wanted a fair shot." Martin nodded slowly. "And you've earned it. But this isn't just about you anymore. There are others who went through the same thing. Some never even knew they were being shut out. If you want to take this further, we'll support you." If not, we'll respect that too. Rayhan looked between the two men, the weight of the decision pressing quietly on his chest. He didn't answer right away. He just sat there thinking, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of the chair. Because now, it wasn't just about what had been taken from him. It was about what others were still being denied, quietly, unfairly, without a word. Rayan didn't give them an answer that day. He walked out of the room quietly, thanking both Martin and Mr. Shah, then rode the elevator back down to his floor. His mind wasn't on his work anymore. Even as he stared at his screen, lines of code became a blur. The question sat in his chest like a stone. Do you want to press charges? It echoed every few minutes, reshaping itself into new versions. Do you want to fight back? Do you want justice? Do you want to be the one who breaks the pattern? He wasn't afraid of Cliff Weston. Not anymore. But he wasn't sure if revenge and justice were the same thing. He had seen people in the news dragged through lawsuits, headlines, online hate. He didn't want to be a symbol. He didn't want his face posted again and again. He just wanted to work, to build something, to move forward. And yet, could he really ignore the fact that others like him, kids who never even got the interview, had walked out of that store feeling the same hollow sting? That night, Rayhan sat across from Adil at a tea stall near the train station. They hadn't met in a few days, and Rayhan needed someone to talk to. The street was noisy, but Adil leaned in when he heard about the conversation with Martin. "They're asking if you want to press charges?" he repeated, eyebrows raised. "Bro, that's big." "I know," Rayhan said, stirring his tea slowly. "I don't know what to do." Adil leaned back. "Look, if it were me, I'd say yes in a second. Not just because of what he did to you, but because people like him have been doing this for years. They just don't get caught." Rayhan nodded. "But if I go through with this, it'll become public. Everyone will know. I'll get dragged into interviews, articles, comments. Some people will say I'm doing it for attention. And some people will say you're doing it for the right reasons," Adil replied. "Because you are." Rayhan stared down at his cup. He wasn't someone who liked attention. Even now, when people in the office smiled at him or praised his work, he kept his head down. But the idea of Cliff walking into another company, another job, and repeating the same pattern, it stayed in his mind like an itch he couldn't ignore. Across town, Martin sat alone in his office long after everyone had gone home. A tablet lay in front of him with a file open. Cliff's full record. The man had worked in 3 other companies before NextBite. 2 of those jobs ended with vague HR notes. One included the phrase multiple complaints, poor communication with candidates. But none of those companies had taken it further. No one wanted the mess. They had just let him go quietly. Martin didn't believe in quiet exits anymore. The next day, Rayhan showed up early again. He hadn't made a decision yet, but he had made a promise to himself. Whatever happened, he wouldn't be silent just to make others comfortable. When Martin saw him in the hallway, he didn't ask anything, just gave a respectful nod and kept walking. The company was giving him space, but it wouldn't last long. That afternoon, an email landed in Martin's inbox. Subject, final decision. It was from Rayhan. No greeting, no long explanation. Just a few lines, carefully written. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I also don't want the next person to be treated the way I was. If pressing charges means making that stop, then yes, let's do it." Martin read it twice. Then he forwarded it to legal with one word. Proceed. The storm was coming, but this time it wouldn't hit Rayhan. It would hit the one who thought he could get away with silence. The lawsuit was filed quietly, but it didn't stay quiet for long. Within 3 days of the court documents being made public, the headlines started appearing across social media and news outlets. Teen intern files discrimination lawsuit against former NextBite manager. CEO backs young interns, legal action in historic move. Company breaks silence on hiring bias. This teen sparked it. The moment the news broke, Rayhan's name began to circle again. But this time the reaction was different. People weren't just supportive. They were watching closely. This wasn't just a feel-good story anymore. It was becoming a case study, a signal. Parents, students, working professionals, people across the country started sharing their own experiences under the hashtag #NumberFairChance. Stories poured in about silent rejections, interviews that ended before they began, resumes tossed aside without a second look. Rayhan hadn't meant to start anything bigger than himself, but it had already become something more. Inside Nextbyte headquarters, the atmosphere shifted too. Some departments treated Rayhan with quiet respect, a few offering longer smiles in the hallways. Others avoided his gaze altogether, whispering behind their monitors. People had their opinions. Some admired him. Some resented him. Some were just uncomfortable now that the company's polished image had cracked wide open. Rayhan didn't react to any of it. He kept his routine the same: early arrival, focused work, calm presence. But beneath that steady surface, he felt the weight growing. It wasn't fear, it was responsibility. He had chosen to press charges not to punish, but to change something. Now he had to carry that choice, no matter how heavy it got. The legal team contacted him 2 days after the filing. Mr. Shaw met him in a quiet office again and explained what to expect. "They'll try to discredit you," he said plainly. "Say you weren't qualified. Say you're just angry. They may even pull personal information, school records, social media, anything that makes you look unstable." Rayhan nodded slowly. "They won't find anything. I've got nothing to hide." Mr. Shaw studied him for a moment. "Most people your age wouldn't handle this like you are." "I'm not doing this to win a case," Rayhan said. "I'm doing it so someone else doesn't have to go through it." Meanwhile, Cliff Weston had resurfaced. In a brief interview with a low-traffic blog, he denied everything. "This is just another case of a kid with a chip on his shoulder," he said. "Everyone wants to blame something when they don't get the job. I didn't even remember his name until all this noise started." He smirked through the interview, saying things like, "I go by instinct," and "people need thicker skin these days." What he didn't know was that the blog was being monitored, and the clip of that smug dismissal was clipped, subtitled, and posted on several high-profile platforms within hours. And people watched it. A lot of people. The backlash was immediate. People didn't just find his words disgusting, they found them familiar. That subtle tone of condescension, that laugh, the dismissive wave of responsibility. Comments filled with anger and disgust flooded the post. Some former employees came forward anonymously to confirm that Cliff had always preferred a certain type when hiring, and others admitted they had been told to not bother with certain applicants in the past. Martin watched all of this unfold with quiet intensity. He didn't post statements, didn't go on camera. He believed the story was already loud enough, and the truth didn't need him to shout. Instead, he focused on supporting Rayhan behind the scenes. Resources, mentorship, protection if needed. Rayhan had earned his place. Martin was going to make sure no one took it away. Back at home, Shabana noticed Rayhan wasn't eating as much. He still smiled, still talked. But he was caring more now, more than a 17-year-old should. One night, as they sat eating in silence, she reached over and placed a hand gently on his. "You are not fighting this alone," she said softly. "Don't ever forget that." He didn't reply, just nodded. But in that moment, the pressure in his chest eased, even just a little. The court date was set. Cliff had hired his own attorney, someone slick and expensive looking. But Rayhan didn't flinch. He showed up to every prep meeting on time, took notes, and asked questions. He wore the same jacket he had worn to that first interview, not out of defiance, but as a reminder of who he was then and who he had become since. The world wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting. And Rayhan, once quietly ignored in a small office with a cold handshake, was now standing at the center of something far bigger than rejection. He was standing in the center of change. The morning of the first hearing arrived with heavy clouds sitting low over the city. It had rained earlier, leaving the streets wet and reflective, as if the world itself had been scrubbed clean for something important. Rayhan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt with quiet hands. He didn't have a suit, just a simple navy button-up and dark pants. But it was pressed and clean, and it was enough. Shabana handed him a folded napkin with paratha inside as he stepped out. "Eat something," she said, trying to sound casual, though her eyes were full. He took it, smiled, and nodded. "I will." Neither of them mentioned the court or what was waiting there. They didn't need to. At the courthouse, cameras were already outside. Not a crowd, but enough reporters to make the air feel tighter. Rayhan wasn't famous, not in the usual way, but his story had struck a nerve. For some, he was a quiet hero. For others, just another headline in a world drowning in outrage. But none of that mattered to him now. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here to be heard. Martin arrived just before the hearing started, accompanied by Mr. Shaw and the rest of the legal team. He didn't say much, just placed a firm hand on Rayhan's shoulder and gave a single nod. No speeches, no drama, just quiet support. Inside the courtroom, Cliff Weston sat on the opposite side, dressed in a dark gray suit that looked more expensive than it needed to be. He didn't look nervous. He looked annoyed, like he was being forced to attend something beneath him. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Dana Cross, kept whispering into his ear, occasionally smirking at something she saw on her phone. Rayhan saw it all, but he didn't react. When the judge entered, the room settled. The lawyers began with their usual introductions, laying out timelines, evidence, and witness lists. Rayhan sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed forward. But when it came time for him to speak, he stood without being asked twice. His voice didn't shake. "I went to the Midtown Next Bite store to apply for a part-time job," he said. "I brought my resume. I was early. I sat for an interview with Mr. Cliff Weston. He didn't ask about my experience. He didn't look at my resume. He said I didn't fit the culture. When I asked what that meant, he just smiled and ended the interview." Dana Cross stood, ready to poke holes. "Mr. Khan, did he mention your race directly at any point during this conversation?" "No," Rayhan said. "He didn't have to." Some people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. "Did you raise your voice? Make any accusations? Cause any kind of disruption?" Number I thanked him and left. Dana paused. "Then isn't it possible you misunderstood his intentions? That you're simply projecting your own assumptions?" Rayhan looked directly at her. "If I'm wrong, then why am I not the only one who experienced it?" Mr. Shaw stood immediately after, producing statements from other past applicants, some anonymous, others bold enough to sign their names. All of them described the same pattern: short interviews, vague rejections, the same phrases repeated. Not a good fit, not the right energy, not what the store is looking for, and every single one of them shared something else. They were all young, all qualified, and all people of color. Then came the videos. A store customer had filmed part of Rayhan's interview from behind a shelf, catching Cliff's dismissive body language. The way he waved off Rayhan's resume, the final shrug before ending it all in under 5 minutes. Another video showed Cliff joking with a coworker after the interview, muttering, "Thought he was walking into a scholarship, not a store." The courtroom fell quiet. Cliff tried to speak, but his lawyer gently touched his arm. It was too late. The damage was done. By the end of the session, the judge didn't rule. This was just the beginning of the proceedings, but the direction was clear. Cliff's defense had taken its first hit, and hard. Outside the courthouse, the reporters had grown in number. Microphones, cameras, questions shouted over each other. Rayhan didn't stop to answer any of them. He just walked to the curb, where Shabana was waiting with a thermos of warm chai and a folded scarf. "You didn't look nervous at all," she said as he approached. "I was," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Still," she smiled, handing him the chai. "You look like someone who knew why he was there." Rayhan took the cup, holding it carefully between both hands. "I think I do now." That night, the clip of his testimony, just a 40-second snippet, was posted online. It went everywhere. Not because he raised his voice, not because he said anything explosive, but because he didn't. He stood calmly, explained what happened, and said the truth out loud, without apology, without theatrics. And somehow, in a world addicted to noise, that silence hit louder than any shout. The days following the first hearing brought a kind of tension Rayhan hadn't experienced before. Not fear. He had faced that already, back when rejection felt like the end. This was something different. It was pressure. The kind that builds when the world starts looking at you as more than a person, as a symbol. His face was now part of a conversation much bigger than him. On news panels, legal experts debated what the case could mean for corporate hiring practices. On social media, strangers called him brave, others called him dramatic, and some, quiet, hidden behind anonymous profiles, called him a liar. But Rayhan didn't read the comments. He read his code. Every day he showed up to Next Byte headquarters like before. Same time, same seat, same focus. But the company wasn't the same. Departments had begun holding mandatory inclusion briefings. HR meetings had doubled. Managers were now required to submit detailed post-interview reports with specific evaluation points. Martin's orders were clear. Transparency wasn't optional anymore. He had turned Rayhan's experience into the foundation for a complete reworking of their internal systems. Still, not everyone embraced the change. In hushed corners of the building, some employees whispered about the lawsuit, muttering things like, "It's too much," or "He's just a kid," or "This is going to ruin us." Some rolled their eyes when they passed Rayhan in the hallway. Some avoided him altogether, pretending he wasn't there. Others, like Alia and Faraz, stood closer. They made sure he never felt alone. Faraz pulled him aside one afternoon. "There's going to be more noise," he said, "but don't let it take your eyes off what you're building here. We see you." Not as a story, as a colleague, that meant more to Rayhan than any headline. Meanwhile, Cliff Weston's side was unraveling fast. His attorney, Dana Cross, filed a motion to dismiss based on lack of direct racial language. But the judge rejected it, citing established patterns of discriminatory conduct supported by testimony and documentation. Cliff was no longer just a former manager. He was now a defendant in a public discrimination suit, backed by one of the most progressive CEOs in the industry. His past employers were being contacted. Old colleagues were being asked questions. And with every step forward, Cliff's carefully built career continued to crack open like dry earth under heavy rain. One afternoon, Martin invited Rayhan to his office for a quiet check-in. There were no assistants, no lawyers, just the two of them, sitting by the wide window as soft rain dotted the glass. "You okay?" Martin asked. Rayhan nodded. "I think so." Martin leaned back slightly. "I just wanted to say, whatever happens in court, you've already changed more than most people do in their entire lives." "I didn't mean to," Rayhan said, honest as always. "I know. That's why it matters." They sat in silence for a moment before Martin continued. "Do you want to know why I reached out to you in the first place? The real reason?" Rayhan looked up. "Sure. It wasn't just the post, or the video, or the fact that you were mistreated," Martin said. "It was your silence. That day you didn't yell. You didn't complain online. You walked out of that store with your head up and went home. You were willing to carry that pain quietly. And to me, that said more than any statement ever could." Rayhan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just gave a small nod and looked back out the window. The next day, he received a letter. It wasn't from a lawyer or the press. It was handwritten, slightly shaky, and signed at the bottom. Hamid Hussein, 62 years old, retired teacher, Faisalabad. The letter read, "Son, I saw you on the news. I don't know you, but I felt like I was watching my own story, just in a different time. We've all been told we're not enough, that we don't belong. You stood there and proved that we do. I never thought I'd live long enough to see someone say it with so much calm. Keep standing. You're not just standing for yourself anymore." Rayhan held the letter for a long time. Later that night, he sat in his room, the letter folded neatly beside his keyboard, the case file still open on his screen. And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small moment of pride. Not loud, not bold, just quiet and certain. He had never wanted to lead a movement. He had just wanted to be treated fairly. But now that the world was listening, he was going to make sure it kept listening. Because this wasn't about getting even anymore. It was about getting things right. As the court proceedings moved into their second phase, the tone of the entire case shifted. What began as a single voice speaking up against quiet discrimination had now become a documented, undeniable pattern of systemic exclusion. With every new session, more evidence surfaced, testimonies from past applicants who had never known one another, each echoing the same story. Rayhan's wasn't an isolated experience. It was the thread that had unraveled something larger, and the courtroom could feel it. The judge, a middle-aged woman with years of experience handling corporate misconduct cases, was measured but visibly attentive. She asked questions that cut through legal fluff. She didn't tolerate distractions. "This is not a case of feelings," she said during one hearing. "This is a case of patterns, choices, and consequences." Cliff's legal team began to stumble. Their earlier strategy, to paint Rehan as simply inexperienced or mistaken, no longer held weight. His academic records were flawless, his community service hours impressive. His internship performance at NextBite had been reviewed and praised by multiple senior staff. His calm testimony, unwavering even under pressure, made it harder for anyone to argue he was exaggerating. Dana Cross tried to pivot. She brought forward Cliff's performance reviews, clean, with no formal complaints, and claimed there had been no intention to harm. But the courtroom wasn't moved. Intention no longer mattered. Impact did. And the impact of Cliff's actions had already rippled far beyond one store, one city, one boy. Outside the courthouse, public opinion was growing louder. A journalist from an international news agency reached out for an interview. Rehan declined, not because he was afraid, but because he didn't want to be turned into a headline while the case was still unfolding. He wasn't looking for praise. He was looking for change. At NextBite HQ, Martin continued pushing internal reform. A new recruitment task force had been formed, staffed with people from diverse backgrounds, tasked with reviewing hiring processes across every store nationwide. Anonymous reporting channels were set up for job applicants and current employees alike. And perhaps most importantly, Martin had quietly started funding a mentorship program for underprivileged students interested in tech. He named it the Khan Fellowship, without even telling Rehan at first. When Rehan found out, through a stray internal email, he confronted Martin in the break room. "You didn't need to name it after me," he said. Martin stirred sugar into his tea and replied simply, "I didn't name it for who you are now. I named it for the boy who walked out of that interview without raising his voice." That silence? It made more noise than anything else. Back in court, Cliff's defense finally called him to testify. He walked into the witness box with the same smirk he had worn in the blog interview. But this time, there was no audience to impress. The courtroom was still, the judge's expression neutral, and the jury, composed of everyday citizens, some of whom had likely faced discrimination in their own lives, watched him closely. Cliff tried to defend his decisions, saying things like gut instinct, first impressions, and store culture. But when asked directly why he had failed to hire a single applicant of color in over 8 months, he had no answer. When asked why his interview notes were always vague or missing, he blamed busy schedules. And when asked if he believed Rehan was qualified, he stumbled for the first time. I don't remember his resume clearly," he said. "I interviewed a lot of people." Mr. Shaw, standing with quiet confidence, responded, "That's strange. He remembers every word you said to him." The silence after that felt longer than it was. Outside, protest signs had started appearing near the courthouse gates. Not loud protests, not chaotic, just firm messages held by people who had once felt invisible. "Higher fare. I was Rehan. We belong here." In one corner, a girl not much older than Rehan stood holding a hand-painted sign that simply said, "Thank you." Back at home, Shabana watched the hearings from their small TV, her hands quietly folded in her lap. She didn't speak during the broadcast. She just listened. And each time she saw her son on screen, shoulders straight, voice steady, she whispered the same quiet prayer. Let truth protect him. Rehan had never imagined courtrooms or cameras when he first walked into that store for an interview. He had wanted a part-time job, a little income, a foot in the door. He had wanted to be seen, heard, respected. And yet, through that simple wish, he had become something more. He had become undeniable. And while the court still had rulings to make, timelines to follow, and paperwork to sort, one thing was already clear to everyone watching. Rehan Khan hadn't just been wronged. He had reshaped the rules that allowed it to happen. The final hearing approached like a slow-moving storm. Everyone involved could feel it. The weight, the tension, the sense that something irreversible was about to happen. For Rehan, the night before wasn't filled with nerves, but a strange kind of peace. He didn't rehearse anything. He didn't prepare statements or reread the documents his legal team had compiled. He simply sat on the balcony outside his room, legs stretched out, a mug of warm tea in his hands while the city buzzed quietly below. Inside, Shabana was ironing his shirt, the same one he'd worn to that first failed interview. She insisted on it. "Let it be part of the story," she said softly. "Let them see what they ignored the first time." Morning came, and the air was crisp. As they arrived at the courthouse, there were more people than before. The media vans lined both sides of the street, and a quiet crowd stood outside the gates, not chanting, not yelling, just present. Some held banners. Some held their children's hands. Some just stood with folded arms and eyes locked on the entrance, as if witnessing something that didn't belong to the past anymore, something that belonged to them. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. No loud voices, no objections. Everyone knew the judge would be giving her final remarks and the initial verdict on liability. Damages, if awarded, would come later. But this decision, whether what had happened to Rehan had been unjust under the law, would set the tone for everything else. Rehan sat with Mr. Shaw on one side, Martin just behind him. Cliff sat on the other, alone now. His lawyer was present, but the arrogance that had once clung to him, like expensive cologne, was gone. He looked smaller, not in height, but in presence. A man realizing too late that reputation cannot protect you from the truth. When the judge began to speak, her tone was clear and deliberate. This court has reviewed all presented evidence, including documentation, witness testimony, and video footage. The plaintiff, Rehan Khan, presented a consistent and credible account of his experience, corroborated by multiple independent sources. The defendant failed to demonstrate non-discriminatory reasons for the rejection or provide a record of equitable hiring practices. Rehan kept his eyes down. He didn't move. The judge continued, "This is not a case of misunderstanding. This is a case of exclusion built into a pattern of behavior. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff." A pause. In plain words, Mr. Khan was denied an opportunity he had earned because of how he looked, not who he was. And today, the law recognizes that as unacceptable. The room was silent. Then came a faint sound behind Rehan, Martin exhaling, long and steady. Aliyah, seated in the back row, gripped the edge of her seat, her eyes glassy. Even Faraz, the man who never raised his voice, lowered his head and closed his eyes, quietly thankful. Cliff didn't react. Or maybe he couldn't. The verdict had taken more than his job. It had taken away the wall of excuses he had built around his decisions for years. His silence now wasn't dignity, it was collapse. Outside, the news spread in minutes. Phones lit up. Headlines flashed. Rehan Khan wins discrimination lawsuit. Company backs intern. Judge cites pattern of exclusion. Journalists scrambled to get statements. Cameras turned to the courthouse doors. But Rehan didn't come out with arms raised or fists clenched. He stepped outside slowly, hands in his pockets, the same calm expression he'd worn since the beginning. The crowd didn't cheer. They just clapped, soft and steady, a wall of quiet support that wrapped around him like armor. One woman near the front reached out and touched his arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her eyes said enough. Adil found him in the crowd moments later, his grin wide. "Bro," he said, shaking his head. "Do you even get what you just did?" Rehan shrugged. "I said what happened. That's all." Adil laughed. "Yeah," and the whole country listened. Later that evening, Rehan sat with Shabana again, the sun dipping low behind the buildings. She handed him a cup of tea and asked, "So, how does it feel?" Rehan took a slow sip before answering. "It feels like breathing after holding it in too long." She smiled, brushed his hair off his forehead, and said nothing more. That night, Martin sent Rehan a short message. "Whatever happens next, this company, this industry, this world is already better because you spoke up." Rehan read it twice, then closed his phone, shut off his light, and lay back on his bed. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything tomorrow, or explain, or defend. He had been denied a chance because of his skin, but he had taken that denial, turned it into truth, and handed it back to the world. And the world, slowly, finally, had listened. Days passed, but the impact of the verdict didn't fade. If anything, it spread wider, into boardrooms, classrooms, job portals, and training programs. Rehan's case had become more than legal history. It had become a mirror held up to hiring systems across the country. Companies rushed to review their recruitment procedures. Some made real changes. Others just updated their websites with new diversity statements. But beneath the surface, the message was clear. The way people were hired could no longer be hidden behind vague smiles and empty interviews. Rayhan returned to NextBite the following Monday like it was any other day. No red carpet, no special announcement. Just a quiet nod from the security guard at the entrance, a friendly smile from the receptionist, and a coffee left for him by Aliyah on his desk with a sticky note that read, "Justice tastes better with caffeine." But something had changed. People moved differently around him, not out of fear, but out of recognition. They weren't walking on eggshells, they were standing straighter, as if his presence had made everyone a little more aware of their own choices, their own words, their own silence, and the company itself. It felt sharper now, a little less glossy, but a little more real. Martin met with Rayhan privately that afternoon. No formal agenda. Just two chairs near the window, a notebook open between them, and a quiet question. "What do you want to do next?" Rayhan didn't answer right away. For the first time in months, he had the space to think not about what had been taken from him, but what he wanted to build. Not in response to pain, but in pursuit of purpose. "I want to work on something that opens doors," he said at last. "Not just for me, for others like me, kids who never even get the first interview." Martin nodded. "Then let's build it." They began sketching out ideas that same week, an internal system that would scan hiring data across all NextBite stores, flag potential patterns of bias, and allow job applicants to submit anonymous feedback on their interview experiences. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be a start, a tool with memory, a system that listened. Rayhan worked late that week, not because anyone told him to, but because the project felt personal. He wasn't just coding lines. He was carving something into the foundation of the company, proof that silence could become structure. Outside the corporate walls, things kept moving. Cliff's license to manage retail operations was suspended pending further investigation. He'd lost not only his job, but his access to leadership roles in the industry. And despite a few interviews where he tried to reframe himself as misunderstood, public trust didn't return. No one was buying it anymore. Accountability had finally caught up. Rayhan received letters, dozens, from students, from parents, from teachers. Some from strangers who had once walked out of interviews with the same quiet ache he knew too well. One letter came from a young boy in Karachi. "I didn't know someone like me could win. You made me believe I can try." Another came from a hiring manager in Lahore. "Your case made me rethink everything. I interviewed differently this week. I listened longer. I asked fairer questions." Thank you, Rayhan kept the letters in a folder on his desk, reading them slowly, one by one. Not because he needed the praise, but because each word reminded him of why he spoke up, why he didn't walk away quietly. On Friday, a small event was held in NextBite's main auditorium. No cameras, no press, just staff, a few board members, and a modest wooden stage. Martin stood up with a mic in his hand and said, "Sometimes change doesn't come from the top. Sometimes it walks into the room, is told it doesn't belong, and still finds its way to the center." He gestured toward Rayhan, who was standing near the back. "This company will never forget what you've shown us," Martin said. "Not just that bias exists, but that integrity can beat it, quietly, consistently, and completely." There was no thunderous applause, just a steady standing ovation, unforced, sincere, and powerful. Later that night, as Rayhan walked home under the fading orange sky, he passed by the very store where it had all begun, the NextBite Midtown branch. Its windows were clean, the "We're hiring" sign freshly placed. He stopped for a moment, not to stare, not to relive it, just to look. Then he walked on. He didn't need revenge. He had already rebuilt what they tried to take. Not just a job, not even justice. He had rebuilt belief, and not only in himself, but in a system that, for once, had finally listened, finally changed, and finally said, "You were right." Months passed. The buzz around the case slowly faded, as all stories do. Headlines shifted, other issues took center stage, and Rayhan's name disappeared from the trending lists. But what he had done didn't disappear. it remained, quietly woven into the systems he helped change, into the mindset of managers now trained to see beyond their assumptions, into the confidence of young people who now applied for jobs with their full names and their full selves. Rehan chose not to speak at big conferences, despite multiple invitations. He turned down interviews from major news networks, politely but firmly. He didn't want to become someone else's poster. He didn't want to be celebrated in theory while other kids were still turned away in reality. He believed change should be a habit, not a headline. Instead, he focused on his work. He completed his internship with distinction, and when NextBite offered him a full-time role in their diversity and innovation program, he accepted. But under one condition, that he could continue studying part-time and that they'd support others from his background in joining the tech space. Martin agreed without hesitation. The Khan Fellowship expanded within a year to include 20 students from underserved communities across the country. Each received mentorship, training, and guaranteed internships within the company. Every one of them knew who had made that possible, even if Rehan never introduced himself as the reason. He met them sometimes, quietly, without a stage. He'd sit across from them, listen to their ideas, read through their resumes, ask about their goals. And when one of them would finally ask, "How did you get into all this?" he'd just smile and say, "It's a long story." But sometimes, just sometimes, he would tell it. Not the legal part, not the courtroom or the cameras, but the moment that still burned quietly in the back of his mind, sitting across from a man who didn't read his resume, who dismissed him without a word, and who, for one small moment, made him question whether everything he'd worked for even mattered, and how, instead of fighting fire with fire, he chose stillness. He walked away, and then, step by step, walked back into that same world, stronger, smarter, and unshakable. One rainy afternoon, after a long session helping the next cohort of interns settle in, Rehan stopped by the community center where he used to volunteer. It hadn't changed much. The paint was peeling in places. The old benches still creaked, but the smiles were the same. Uncle Fareed was still there, still struggling with his phone, still typing with one finger. When Rehan walked in, the old man's face lit up. "Look who became famous," he said with a grin. "I didn't become famous," Rehan replied, pulling up a chair. "Just useful." They laughed quietly. The kind of laughter that doesn't need volume, just shared memory. After helping him set up his phone settings, again, Rehan walked out into the street. The rain had slowed. The sky was the soft gray of early evening. He looked ahead, saw a group of teenagers standing under a shop's shade, one of them holding a printed resume in a plastic folder, wrinkled at the edges. He watched for a second, then turned the other way and walked home. Not because he didn't care, because he already knew. His story had reached them. And now they were walking into their own interviews, not afraid of rejection, not nervous about how they looked, not worried about the name on their CV. Because somewhere, in some room, someone had to think twice. Someone had to check their words. Someone had to remember what happened when a boy named Rehan Khan didn't raise his voice, but raised a standard. That was his victory, not the courtroom, not the articles, not even the verdict. His real victory was silence that changed things, and a world that finally couldn't ignore it. If this story touched you, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this.